It is not only permitted, but it is also equitable and just to slay tyrants, says Bishop John of Salisbury, a 12th century theologian. Many Catholics today grew up and remain surrounded by the anti-Catholic modern world, animated by the spirit of rebellion and French Revolution. Often when they turn against the modern world, instead of fighting true doctrine, they merely reverse their liberal worldview. When the world says, "Always rebel," they now say, "Always obey." But the truth and the Catholic tradition are not so easily ascertained. Virtue lies between two opposite vices. Men fleeing one error can easily fall into another. In rejecting the spirit of rebellion, we must not give in to the spirit of servility. Catholics generally owe obedience to public authority because, as St. Paul wrote, "Let every soul be subject to higher powers. For there is no power but from God, and those that are ordained of God. Therefore he that resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist purchase to themselves damnation." This, however, hasn't stopped Catholic theologians, St. Thomas Aquinas chief amongst them, from proclaiming the right to resist tyrannical governments, and even, in some extraordinary circumstances, to kill tyrants. This is because we have a duty to submit to legitimate authority. St. Thomas writes, "If to provide itself with a king belongs to the right of a given multitude, it is not unjust that the king be deposed or have his power restricted by that same multitude, if, becoming a tyrant, he abuses the royal power. It must not be thought that such a multitude is acting unfaithfully in deposing the tyrant, even though it had previously subjected itself to him in perpetuity, because he himself has deserved that the covenant with his subjects should not be kept, since in ruling the multitude he did not act faithfully as the office of a king demands." End quote. And in another place he writes, "A tyrannical government is not just because it is directed not to the common good, but to the private good of the ruler, as the philosopher states. Consequently, there is no sedition in disturbing a government of this kind, unless indeed the tyrant's rule be disturbed so inordinately that his subjects suffer greater harm from the consequent disturbance than from the tyrant's government. Indeed, it is the tyrant rather that is guilty of sedition, since he encourages discord and sedition among his subjects, that he may lord over them more securely, for this is tyranny, being conducive to the private good of the ruler and to the injury of the multitude. Thus we must first ask, what is the difference between a legitimate ruler and a tyrant? Bishop John of Salisbury tells us, "The prince fights for the laws and liberty of the people. The tyrant supposes that nothing is done unless the laws are cancelled and the people are brought into servitude. The prince is a sort of image of divinity, and the tyrant is an image of the strength of the adversary and the depravity of Lucifer." End quote. This is a very general answer. There are obviously countless specific ways in which a ruler can commit tyranny. Suffice it to say that, as we know from Pope Leo XIII, the power to rule is conceded to men for the common good. Thus, there are two main ways in which a man can commit an act of tyranny: by turning his power against God and natural law, or by turning it against the common good. Father Juan de Mariana gives a few examples of the crimes of a tyrant. The tyrant always seeks to persecute and unjustly humiliate everyone, but he directs his fury especially towards powerful and virtuous men. These individuals are always more suspicious to him than the wicked, because their virtue is a threat to him. He oppresses the citizens by burdening them with a multitude of taxes he invents daily. He constructs great buildings and monuments at the expense of the sweat and tears of his subjects. He takes away their weapons and prevents them from exercising physical strength through military training, which could inspire heroic valor. He prevents the gatherings of citizens, and through a secret and inquisitorial police force, he strips them of the ability to speak or even to hear discussions about the Republic. Father de Mariana wrote that at the end of the 16th century, and yet it is a very modern description. And in keeping with the theme of modernity, it is also worth pointing out that St. Thomas said that not only monarchical governments are capable of tyranny, but even democratic governments can be tyrants. In this way, the whole people will be as one tyrant, he writes. Now that we know who a tyrant is, and more or less how he behaves, we ask what should be done to him. There are step-by-step instructions which can be derived from theologians and are presented by Father de Mariana. If a ruler is bad, that is, privately immoral or just incompetent or harsh, we must remain obedient. Because St. Peter writes, "Servants, be subjects to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the froward." If the ruler actually becomes a tyrant and isn't merely a bad ruler, he should be usually tolerated, because there exists a serious risk that taking any action against him can fail and cause him to increase his tyranny in retaliation, or he could be replaced by a worse tyrant, or a civil war could break out and devastate the country. To quote St. Thomas, "If there be not an excess of tyranny, it is more expedient to tolerate the milder tyranny for a while, than by acting against the tyrant to become involved in many perils more grievous than the tyranny itself." If, however, a tyrant has become intolerable, the public authority, that is, some public body representing the Commonwealth, such as a parliament, should gather and demand amendment and reparations from the ruler. If he rectifies his behavior, they should resume their submission to him, but if he refuses, they should depose him and even wage war against him. The theologian Suarez states clearly, if then a lawful king is ruling in tyrannical fashion, and if the state finds at hand no other means of self-defense than expulsion and deposition of this king, the said state, acting as a whole and in accordance with the public and the general deliberations of its communities and leading men, may depose him. This would be permissible both by virtue of natural law, which renders it licit to repel force with force, and also by virtue of the fact that such a situation, calling for measures necessary to the very preservation of the state, is always understood to be accepted from that original agreement by which the state transferred its power to the king. End quote. In his writings on tyranny, Suarez makes an important distinction between a lawful king who is ruling in tyrannical fashion but has originally obtained his power legitimately, and a usurper whom he calls a true tyrant. He writes on the distinction, there is a great difference, however, between such a tyrant and a wicked but legitimate king. For a true king, though he may govern in a tyrannical manner, is not inflicting actual violence upon the state subject to him, so long as he does not begin an unjust war against it, and consequently, in so far as he is concerned, no occasion for defense is offered, and no subject may attack him or wage war against him on defensive grounds. A true tyrant, on the other hand, is inflicting continual and actual violence upon the state as long as he unjustly retains the royal power and reigns by force, so that the said state continually wages against him an actual or virtual war, not vengeful in its character, so to speak, but defensive. Moreover, provided the state makes no declaration to the contrary, it is always regarded as willing to be defended by any of its citizens, or, for that matter, even by any foreigner, and therefore, if it cannot be defended in any way save by the slaying of the tyrant, any one of the people can licitly slay him. Thus it is indeed true, strictly speaking, that this act of slaughter is committed under the circumstances described not by private but by public authority, or rather by the authority either of the kingdom willing to be defended, by any citizen whomsoever, as by its own members or organ, or else by the authority of God, the author of nature, who gives to every individual the power of defending the innocent. End quote. And here we've returned to the words of Bishop John of Salisbury. It is not only permitted, but it is also equitable and just to slay tyrants. Some may object that the Council of Constance condemned this view. As Suarez points out, nothing could be further from the truth. The Council condemned the following proposition: any tyrant can and ought to be killed, licitly and meritoriously, by any of his vassals or subjects, even by means of plots and blandishments or flattery, notwithstanding any oath taken or treaty made with the tyrant, and without waiting for a sentence or a command from any judge. Suarez explains, "For as I have said, the Council of Constance does not lay down the definite and universal negation that no tyrant may be slain, but simply condemns the universal affirmation that every tyrant may be slain, a condemnation stated not in an absolute form, but rather with a number of qualifying terms, so that the declaration of the said council is reduced to the following loose formula: not every tyrant may be slain before sentence has been pronounced against him." End quote. Usurpers, as he explained, can be slain before sentence, though not as a punishment or out of vengeance or lust for power, but in defense of the Commonwealth. He writes, "The private individual who slays a tyrant of the kind in question does not commit the deed without public authorization, since he is acting both by the authority of a tacitly consenting state and by the authority of God, who has granted to every man through the natural law the right to defend himself and his state from the violence inflicted by such a tyrant." End quote. He also points out that this is the position of St. Thomas Aquinas and the common opinion of theologians. An example of a usurper was Julius Caesar. Now we are clear as to the case of usurpers, but what of those who have obtained the power legitimately, but abuse their power? Again from Suarez, "In short, when a king has been lawfully deposed, he is no longer a legitimate king or prince, and therefore the statement of the Council of Constance, which has reference to legitimate kings, cannot hold true in his case. And furthermore, if after the lawful deposition of such a king he should persist in his obstinacy and forcibly retain the royal power, he will become a tyrant even in regard to his title, since he is not a lawful king, nor is it by any just title that he holds kingly power." End quote. That is, a tyrannical ruler can be deposed and simply becomes a usurper if he does not willingly relinquish his power, and can be killed in the same way as a usurper. He also mentioned that a state may impose the penalty of death on a tyrannical ruler when deposing him, but this penalty cannot be carried out by just any individual, but only by a legally appointed executioner. We see clearly that as a principle, legitimate rulers, even if they commit acts of tyranny, cannot be harmed without a sentence, but have to be deposed. Suarez mentions two exceptions. One in defense of one's own life. Quote, "On the other hand, if one acts in defense of his very life, which the king is attempting to take violently from him, then to be sure it will ordinarily be permissible for the subject to defend himself, even though the death of the prince result from such defense. For the right to preserve one's own life is the greatest right, nor does the prince, in the situation described, labor under any need that obliges the subject to sacrifice his life for his sovereign's sake, since on the contrary, the prince himself has voluntarily and by his unjust behavior placed himself in this perilous position." End quote. This, however, does not apply to the defense of one's property, only one's very life. I would also assume it would apply to the defense of another innocent person, but Suarez doesn't specify. The second exception is when the ruler is actually waging war on the Commonwealth. Quote, "Again, if the question relates to the case in which the Commonwealth itself is to be defended, this violent method of defense is impermissible unless we assume that the king is actually attacking the state with the unjust intention of destroying it and slaughtering the citizens, or that some similar situation exists. Under such circumstances, it will assuredly be permissible to resist the prince, even by slaying him, if defense cannot be achieved in any other fashion. One argument in favor of this assertion is as follows. If such action is licit in order to protect one's own life, far more certainly will it be licit for the sake of the common good. A further argument resides in the fact that the state or the Commonwealth itself is in that case engaged in a just defensive war against an unjust invader, even though he be its own king, so that any citizen whatsoever, acting as a member of that Commonwealth, and impelled, whether expressly or tacitly, by it may therefore defend the said Commonwealth in the course of that conflict in whatsoever way is possible to him." End quote. Suarez stresses, however, that is a very exceptional situation, and if a ruler oppresses and injures the Commonwealth peacefully, that is, without actual violence, then his life remains sacrosanct and he would have to be deposed. We see now that as Catholics and traditionalists, we must be obedient to all legitimate authority, and out of prudence and necessity, we must often obey even tyrants and pray devoutly that God removes them, because we have no strength to do so. Nonetheless, we can work towards overthrowing unjust governments when possible. I will not go through all the examples of tyrant slayers in history to pronounce on whether they acted in accordance with Catholic principles, but I wish to quickly apply these doctrines to the American Revolution. As we have seen, there is nothing in the American Revolution itself which is incompatible with Catholic principles. Declaration of Independence was an act of public authorities which deposed a tyrannical monarch. From that moment, George III was no longer the rightful ruler of the American colonies, although he retained his power over England and his other domains. Because he continued to attempt to rule the colonies, he became a usurper, and his soldiers an invading force. Thus the colonies had every right to wage war against him. It is true that Jefferson inserted that lie that all men were created equal and are endowed with inalienable rights into the Declaration. But as has been pointed out by John Calhoun, the claim is not only untrue, but also completely unnecessary. In the Declaration, there is also a list of grievances, of acts of tyranny committed by the king, and they are the true and just cause of the American Revolution. The argument that the Founding Fathers were in many cases Freemasons does not invalidate their right to oppose tyranny. Firstly, because they acted not as private individuals, but on behalf of states they represented. Secondly, if a Freemason is attacked in his home, he is not deprived of his natural right to self-defense, nor does his defense become Freemasonic itself. American independence rests on solid Catholic and natural principles. Resistance to tyrants is obedience to God. Thus, the state of Virginia rightly chose for its motto the great words Sic semper tyrannis.